Friday morning, and welcome to this week's episode of Finding God in the Dark. My name is Don Stevens,
And my name is Jonathan Campbell.
and this week we are taking a look at a recent, well, I guess it's a 2024 film, right?
Yeah,
Came out this year, well, last year now, it's
yeah.
January. But it's on currently on Peacock called Speak No Evil. This is a remake. I
Oh, it
found
is.
out. It's a
It is.
remake of an older, you know, I guess maybe a 70s or something. I don't
Okay.
know exactly when the original was out.
Okay.
It stars James McAvoy, Mackenzie Davis, Scoot McNairy, Aisling Franciosi.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Two movies in a
um,
row for Scoot for us.
yeah, right. Thinking that name's familiar. Oh yeah, he was last week. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, is directed by James Watkins. It is um what do we categorize it? I think it's might be called a horror, but it's really more of a mystery thriller type
Yeah.
of it's not really
Suspense. I would describe it as a suspenseful movie,
yeah, suspense. There's some horror element to it.
especially toward
Um
the end. There's some.
just particularly at the end, yes.
You know,
Um there is fair warning, a copious amount of sexual innuendo and objectionable language. And look,
yeah.
we, I know I've said this before, I'll say it many, many times. I personally don't have a problem with that stuff, but we want to let people know ahead
Yeah.
of time if
Absolutely.
it's something
It's
if it's
rated
something.
R. I wouldn't take
Right.
your 5-year-old to it. Like,
Right. I didn't sit and watch it with my 12-year-old,
yeah.
My 15-year-old could have watched it with me, but I think he's too busy playing Call of Duty on his phone.
Yeah.
That's another story. Um, I I want to like this movie.
Mhm.
I want to like it.
Okay.
I don't like it.
Okay.
um, it's I don't know. If I jump, I want to maybe jump right to a theological thought here,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Maybe the one thing I think this film really points up is the very real presence of evil in the world.
Yes.
Um, it, the the bad guys in this movie
Yeah.
are exceptionally bad, and you're never really given any reason for it. They're
Mhm.
just awful
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. Just that.
There's no. It's not like, well, they had a bad childhood, or like you're never given any sort of motivation for these just horrible people.
You might kind of for the wife, but you don't know how much what she's saying is true.
Right, because they're so manipulative,
Yeah.
right? They are so they just yeah. It's and all right. You and I know have talked about the idea of retributive justice before.
Mhm.
I think the movie we watched was Mercy, and
Yeah.
that's several years ago.
Yeah.
But there's a scene of that in here.
Mhm.
But other than that, the even your protagonists, even your good guys here,
Yeah.
walk away from this very scarred.
Yeah.
Their lives completely changed. It's
Yeah.
not a happy ending.
No.
Even though the good guys ultimately kind of win,
Yeah.
it's not really a happy ending.
It's kind of a we live in a really broken world. The end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
It-
it, when I watch horror movies, or I watch suspense movies,
yeah.
films like this, I I'm a sucker for a happy ending. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I just am,
You're an American.
I am. It's true. Um, and so, when you get there are certain horror movies I've watched that I can't stand. The Collector. I don't know if you ever, I know you're not a horror fan,
No.
but The Collector is one of those films where the bad guys win. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't like those.
Yeah. So yeah, I think one is I don't know how you deal with this as a person that is more progressive in their understanding of life and theology. I struggle with like I'm doing uh, I'm doing a sermon that just goes deep on baptism this week. Like it just why we do it, what we think happens, what we think God is doing, all that stuff. And so I'm doing what I always do with that kind of stuff. I'm doing a deep dive. I'm reading as much as I can, all the stuff. Well, it's pretty clear from what we have from descriptions of the very earliest part of the church about baptism is that one of the things they did at the beginning of a baptism before they baptized somebody is they anointed them to excise them from demons. They wanted to pour the demons out of the people before they baptized them.
Okay.
And and I think for most modern folks, they hear that and they freak out. Like, what do you mean? And I know from my kind of vantage point of kind of more progressiveness, that idea of demons, because especially with a person, because I'm a person with a disability, people have literally prayed over me, and people oftentimes connect my disability to sin. And so all of that stuff you know, gets wrapped up and like there's just a ball of like, and yet, I think you have to take seriously this idea that the early church really believed there was evil and that evil could really be impacting people's lives and be even in people's lives, and that baptism freed them from sin, but also freed them from evil. And I think as Christians, progressive or conservative, we have to become comfortable with the idea that there is evil in the world. And maybe we see it in different ways or talk about it in different ways, but we can't jettison the idea that as a Christian, we believe there is evil.
Yeah, and I'm with you there. I I think our big challenge comes when we try to, well, is evil, is it personal? Is it a personification,
Yeah,
or is it institutional? And the
yeah,
answer to that is yes.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
we have far too much of a problem in, at least in mainstream American faith, okay, mainstream American Christianity, of trying to, well, we do with evil the same thing we want to do with God. Put it
Yeah,
in a box and contain it and understand it.
yeah.
And it's not something that's that easily categorized and understood.
Well, I think like for me, I don't believe in like a guy with a pitchfork and horns. And I, yeah, yeah, and
Sorry,
and
this just so people don't get confused.
yeah.
This is my Jeep Club. It's the 13th Child Jeep Club, just so it doesn't freak anybody out.
But I do think there seems to be what I've seen in the world, there seems to be a directional nature to evil. And what I mean by that is it seems to have a movement to it. It's just not it's just not kind of present. It seems to be moving toward an end of destruction and kind of revving up anger and hatred in our world.
Constantly trying to take ground,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And to use sort of a war metaphor, right?
And so I really don't talk about evil in terms of like this guy somewhere that's making all these plans or you know kind of comes and whispers in your ear. I do think if we're honest about the way we see the world, there seems to be a force in our world that is trying to push our reality to a place of more violence, more anger, more hatred, more fear. And as Christians, I think we're called to counter that. I mean, it's in our baptismal vows. We were supposed to stand and be kind of a bulwark against evil.
Forces of evil. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Pull that. Wait, let me get a hymnal
yeah.
out.
Pull it out. Yeah, right. Um, and I do agree with you that one James McAvoy plays evil really well.
Ooh, man. I mean, look, I like McAvoy, and I like him. I'll give the film this much credit. I like him more after this film because he's got range,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
yeah,
if you've seen Split, he's
yeah,
got range.
yeah.
Um, you know, but
Um, yeah.
good.
But anyway, one of the things that the last couple years has made me a lot more interested in horror movies. Like for most of my life, I just avoided most of them.
Mhm.
But I heard a commentator talk about the fact that all horror movies are trying to address this deeper kind of fear and anxiety, some kind of anxiety or fear that we have as a collective consciousness of the, collective society. And ever since I heard that, I now kind of explore a horror movie when I watch it and try to find what that is. What is that kind of issue that kind of we fear and we have anxiety about that the horror movie is trying to tap into to kind of freak us out or kind of or to be honest to make us really good horror helps you examine or wants you to examine that deep fear that's kind of there that you're kind of setting on, right? And so that's what I did with this movie. I kind of explored what some of those things are, or what I think they are, maybe. And I didn't talk to the filmmakers, but I think there's something here about they want to explore about the relationship between parents and children, um,
There's definitely some of that. Yep.
especially kind of I felt like this tension between the traditional quote unquote way to deal with children and the modern kind of way of dealing with children and kind of that friction that's there in our society between that. So
Mhm.
I felt like that was there. And then I feel like there was a real conversation about couples and relationships kind of going on as well.
There was, yeah, well, some of the motivating factor for our, what do I want to say, our good guy couple to end
Yeah,
up in the countryside with this bad guy
yeah,
couple
yeah.
was about their relationship and
And then kind of the things that connect both those conversations about parents and children and couples was the idea of what is abuse, because
hmm.
all of that was in there in this movie, I think. And
Are
basically
we thinking like child abuse? I see that, right? Spousal abuse
spousal abuse, both
or
both physical and emotional.
emotional, certainly emotional.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely there. Yep.
Um, and I don't know, it really made me wonder if part of the conversation that the filmmakers were trying to kind of engage with is because the Ben character played by Scoot um, is really attracted to James, the James McAvoy's character Patty. He seems to be attracted to this idea of the strong man. This idea of top, what we might say is like over the top masculinity, like
Right.
kind of like he
The
wants,
alpha male
yeah, the
myth.
alpha. Basically, he wants to be him. On some level, he
Right.
wants to be that kind of that essence of strength and gravitas.
Hmm.
And I think the movie kind of wants to play with, is that a good thing or a bad thing, or is there a good version of it or a bad version of it? And I think that's an interesting conversation because especially if you look at all the conversations that are going on, especially in the internet around what does it mean to be a male, what does it mean to be masculine, what does it mean to be a good father, what does it mean to be a good husband. um, the, a lot of people are having that conversation about you know can you be a masculine male and still be not toxic? And that was kind of the conversation of this movie, right? You know, and I think that conversation is a huge part of Christian conversation, especially in America. I mean, if you go online, most of the really conservative Christian voices that you hear preach that the big problem in the world right now is that we don't have real men. I mean, that you just hear that all the time, you know. And in the back of my head, I think of a Jason Isbell song where one of the lines is, "I wanted to be a real man, whatever the hell that means." Um, and I do think that conversation about how do you be a good father, how do you be a good parent, how do you be a good husband, is a really hard question right now to have and to understand. And I do think a lot of young men are struggling with that. And I wonder if the filmmaker kind of wanted to play around with that idea. I don't know what
Yeah,
you.
it's an interesting thought. I don't know. I want to go back a little bit to what you
Sure.
were saying about um horror films kind of looking at our
Yeah, fears.
dredging up maybe our
Mhm.
darkest fears.
Yeah, yeah.
I think there's also an element of that that allows us to address
Hmm.
our deepest fears
Yep.
and survive them,
Yeah.
you know, to live through them by just being in the theater and watching it, you
Yeah.
know. Now, that being said, there's certainly films that complete like I like horror movies. I've been watching
Yeah.
horror movies since I was a kid, read every Stephen King book ever written,
Yeah.
all of that. Um, but there's still the occasional ones that like I turn it off or I just cringe my way through it.
Yeah.
Like oh, what was the one? Well, there was one where they're climbing down through these caves and catacombs
Yeah.
underneath of Paris, and it was just that whole tight spaces, claustrophobic. That I was like, "Mm."
Yeah.
I and then there's other ones that I don't remember the name of the film, but I turned it on and it's over the opening credits. They're showing someone being tortured, and I won't even go into like the details of it. I just like I don't want to watch that, you
Yeah.
know. So yeah, I think there's part of it that allows us to at least address our really difficult, the things that scare us the most,
Yeah.
and and walk away from it, hopefully.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, this one, I think there's also this sense of now this film, back to Speak
Hmm.
No Evil. Um, I think might have found the boy to be very interesting in that he had a disability, wasn't a birth thing,
No.
was not a
Yeah.
um, and that really plays into the title of the film,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you understand when you see that what Patty and his what I don't remember. Kira's was the wife. Patty and
Yeah.
Kira,
Yeah.
the bad guy family, were doing. You understand why they did what they did to the boy,
Hmm.
um, but it's there's that whole angle of I I would think plays into disability and a fear of that and how
Hmm.
that can be debilitating. I
Absolutely.
know as an able person, okay,
Yeah.
I've never had to deal with any kind of disability other than just being diabetic.
Yeah.
Big deal. Um, but there's that people have asked that hypothetical question. Well, would you rather lose your hearing or your sight? Would you, this kind of stuff. Or like really do we play games around that sort of thing?
Yeah.
I think it's kind of crass, you
Yeah.
know. Um, so I don't know. It's there was an to me there was another element of sort of isolationism, right?
Hmm.
In that this farmhouse is out in the middle of nowhere, and took them a long time to get there, and they couldn't there were no neighbors anywhere nearby, so whatever um that can be a fear for some people, the
Yeah.
idea of being isolated and separated from everything. They had no cell service,
Mhm.
that
Well,
kind of
I
thing.
mean, I think, I mean, I don't want to go too far down the disability rabbit hole because I can go deep.
I'm
But
sure you could.
I do think I used to say in college and seminary, I would describe it as sometimes I felt like able-bodied people could smell death on me, and it freaked them out.
Wow.
Like they, I think I know a lot of people struggle with they project. So they see your disability and they can't in their mind figure out how they would deal with it, and so it pushes them away from you. And like I've had people come up and literally tell me, like, I have mild cerebral palsy. I know I'm sitting down, so some people may not know. I have mild cerebral palsy that affects the left side of my body. I've had it since I was a baby. Uh, um, I've had people come up to me and say, like, I would commit suicide if I had your disability. And I'm just like, what do I do with that? Thanks, man, for sharing. Like,
Wow.
um,
Wow.
and I do think, yeah, that disability for horror movies functions as a way of, again, getting that deep down fear of losing control, losing your ability to communicate. In this movie, losing your ability to communicate. This idea of being kind of isolated and being disconnected from the community. And so I get that and I understand that. And I don't have a problem with it because that is a fear we have. Um, you know, we could have conversations about, okay, people that can't speak or can't communicate in the quote unquote normal way can learn to communicate in other ways. And there's ways to communicate and to have a community even if you can't speak. But I recognize that fear. I think what's interesting to me about this movie is the fear that seems to be there around the relationship we have with our kids or our parents and the relationship we have with our significant others if we have one. You know, how do we really trust that they're there for us? How do we really trust that they'll be there for us? How do we trust um, how do we trust that connection that really is a necessary function of life? Um, because even in the quote unquote good couple, right? The protagonists of the movie, they have a fractured relationship as husband and wife. There's issues around infidelity. There's issues around can they trust one another? Can they depend on one another?
Right.
And then you have this stress between, especially the father and the daughter of the good couple or the good family, because he's struggling to how he wants to parent her because it's not the way his wife wants to parent her, you
Right.
know. And so you see kind of even in the good couple or the good family, you see these issues of parental connection and spousal connection and how do we do it well and how do we not do it well. And I do think for most of us the idea of not being able to trust our spouse or not being able to um, depend on our spouse you know is very difficult at the very best way to put it, can be paralyzing in another way. And then the idea of your parent not loving you or not caring for you or not believing in you is something I think most of us innately fear, right? We want to have our parents approve us, and love us. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because you bring up the relationship between Ben and daughter was Andrea.
Yeah. They called
Yeah,
her Aggie, but yeah.
Addie, right, Addie. Probably Adeline, Addie.
No,
Um,
Aggie. Agnes was her name.
Okay, Agnes. But yeah, between Ben and the father-daughter
Yeah.
relationship, and a lot of that was over um her whoopee is what
Yeah.
I'm going to say. She called it Hoppy, a
Yeah.
bunny,
A
but I
bunch.
mean for most kids it's a whoopee. It's a
Yeah.
security blanket.
Yeah.
For my son, my 14-year-old will kill me for saying this. For him it was for the longest time he carried around a little lamb blanket that was
Yeah.
K.
Yeah.
Um, Little did he know that he picked up the name K from us because it was a little square of a blanket with the lamb's head here and the hindquarters here on the corners, and it
Yeah.
looked like a lamb that had been run over by a truck,
Ugh.
right? So it was like flat blanket with the
Yeah.
the head and the
Yeah.
And we said it looked like roadkill, so we started calling it RK, and he picked up the name K. Poor kid's going to need therapy for that, um, but she had this adherence to
Mhm.
this little wub, and for him, it was like, you're almost 12 years old, you got to let
Yeah.
this thing go,
Yeah.
and there's this is maybe another story arc in the film, is
Yeah.
this sort of coming of age thing,
Yeah.
because eventually she does.
Well,
But
I do think a lot of it comes down to where do we find security? Can we trust what we need to be secure in? And
yeah,
again, that's a very deep human need, and that's a very big theological question. Where do we find security? Where do we find that rest? Um, and for Christian faith, there's always been this understanding that our ultimate security has to rest in God because everything else is unreliable. I mean, it may be reliable sometimes and it may not be reliable other times, but the only security that's ultimate is God, you know. And so having that can be actually those kind of conversations around security can be a way to actually connect people to God because it's recognizing insecurity in your life can help you seek a level of security that you can trust, and that often leads a lot of people to a relationship with God.
the Christian faith, sure.
Yeah,
That's and I guess maybe for me, that's one of the things that's missing from this film, right? Because what it ultimately comes down to is self-reliance,
yeah,
human reliance, and how their own persistence and ingenuity and whatever. I mean, that's great,
yeah.
but ultimately, as a Christian, I want more, right?
Well, and I think that's where, as a Christian, you can have really a lot of fun with that ending. Not fun, I guess. It's like, but you can have a really interesting conversation about that ending because in a world where your security is always on you, this end of the story is always this place of, oh,
Yeah,
it's always this place of kind of just kind of living in your trauma because
yeah,
there's no other place to go because
yeah,
and so I would agree with you that without this idea that there's something larger than the brokenness we see around us, then all life is just trying to avoid evil and trying to avoid disaster, and that's all life ends up being.
yeah.
um, and as a Christian we are called to proclaim that there's something bigger and better than the brokenness of this life.
Yeah, and that's wow. I think that's a perfect place to leave this film. It, there's something better.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a. I think for Christians, this is a challenging film. If you are so inclined as to like these types of films, I would approach this one with caution.
Yeah.
At least as a Christian.
Yeah.
For those who aren't, you watch what you want, right?
Yeah.
We should move on to next week.
Yeah.
And I haven't really thought about what we're going to watch next week. I do want to give folks a heads up.
Yeah.
Um, as we have been mentioning several
Mhm.
times now, we are going to be recording an episode with a special guest the end of this month.
Yep.
The film that we are watching for that episode actually just won the Golden Globe for Best Picture.
Yeah.
But it is a very long film,
Hmm.
a 3.5 hour long film.
With an
It is
intermission.
with an intermission. It is an art house type of film, so it's not going to be very easy to find. It's still in theaters.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm going to suggest that for folks to take a look
Prepare.
out for if they want to watch it ahead of time. We're not
Yeah.
going to watch it this week.
Yeah.
We'll watch it, and discuss it the week that we have our guest on. But that film is called The Brutalist, and it stars Adrian Brody.
Yeah.
and it is yeah, like you said, it's a very long film.
Mhm.
It's a talkie film,
Yeah.
as my kids would say. So, but if you're so inclined and you're following along, you might want to look out for that one
Fair, yeah.
because it's getting a lot of buzz. It didn't just win Golden Globe for Best Picture, it won for Best Actor too for Adrian Brody. So,
Yeah.
but that is not what we're going to watch this week.
No.
This week, um, I don't know. We were going to start looking at stuff that's getting some Oscar buzz,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. Mhm.
I was particularly looking at the animated list, and the only ones on there that were very interesting we've already talked about, like Inside Out 2,
Yeah,
stuff like that. So,
yeah, yeah.
um, what if we did this?
Mhm.
We had discussed before that we were going to do Wicked, and then I
Yeah.
got sick and we postponed that week. What do we go back and revisit that?
Okay, yeah.
Why don't we go see that this week, and then we'll talk about it next week.
Sounds good.
And I promise I won't get sick this time.
It's your
Not
kryptonite, man. It's your
not that
kryptonite.
I wanted to get sick, mind you. I didn't want to get sick, but you
Yeah,
know. So yeah, we'll it's still in theaters. I know it's been very popular. So,
yeah.
um, in fact, I think they've got some theaters they're designating it as a sing along.
Oh,
I
I will
don't
avoid those.
I don't want to go see it there.
No,
I don't know the songs,
no,
other than the little bit I've heard here and there,
no,
but I don't want to go into a show where everybody's singing it.
no, no, no.
I want to hear
Yeah. I
the
want to hear the
performers.
professional singers sing.
Absolutely. All right, man. So next week's film is Wicked, and until next week, friends, keep on finding God in the dark. We will see you all later.
But
Thanks for watching the Finding God in the Dark podcast. If you're enjoying these discussions, please consider hitting the like button down below or subscribing to follow along. We put out weekly episodes on Friday mornings, and we are so glad that you're finding this discussion of theology and film entertaining enough to follow along with us. Take care and God bless, friends.